Welcome to this episode of HKEX Voice. I'm your host, 𝗙cie𝗹𝗹𝗹, Head of Market Development and Head of Global Issuer Services of HKEX. It has been 3 years since HKEX launched a listing reform to welcome more new economy companies, including pre-revenue biotech companies for listing in April 2018. We have just celebrated the 3rd anniversary of the new listing rules last week. In this podcast, we're very pleased to welcome Nisa Leung to share with us how listing reform brings vibrancy and diversity to Hong Kong's healthcare ecosystem. Nisa is a managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners and leading its healthcare investments. Nisa has also joined the Hong Kong Exchange Board of Directors in April. Welcome to the HKEX family and welcome to our podcast, Nisa. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Christina. It's great to be here.
Great. Well, it has been 3 years since we introduced the new listing reform, especially with the biotech listing chapter. We understand that there is a huge momentum of listing interest from healthcare companies, including biotech companies, to come into Hong Kong. We have been seeing quite a number of IPOs in this area, and we're seeing more in the pipeline. So my question is also part of my curiosity is like, how come that there are so many healthcare companies and biotech companies are in the supply and also will be ready for listing in Hong Kong at this period of time, and why they're so interested in coming to Hong Kong instead of other places?
Well, I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I want to illustrate a few points. First, China is now the second largest healthcare market in the world. Second, with the aging population and GDP increase, there's more demand for better healthcare service and drugs. And third, China has become such an important center to provide services, be it in CROs globally, and also selling the products, be it in diagnostic devices or drugs globally as well. And then fourth, I think one of the things is that we see in 2020, say, for example, the VCPE fundraising size has gone to over 1 trillion RMB, which is similar to the 2018-2019 levels. But, and then, of course, most importantly is healthcare is really becoming a core innovative industry in China and getting a lot of support from the government, from the industries and sectors. So what I see is that, the healthcare sector will become even more and more important as we believe that the Chinese healthcare system and the healthcare market and the outreach of the healthcare companies will continue to grow. And the Hong Kong Exchange will be a phenomenal exchange and listing venue for a lot of these companies. We've had, even under COVID, we've had 16 IPOs in the last 15 months as in our firm, and most of them are actually virtual. But, what's really, really interesting is that to see how Hong Kong Exchange have become such an attractive market, given all the circumstances. And as I mentioned before, this is only the beginning. We feel that in the next 10 to 20 years, it's going to become even more important as a venue.
That's great. I mean, we've also seen a lot of scientific breakthroughs in the past few years, especially during COVID-19. And in your view, what would be the new growth areas in terms of subsectors of in biotech or healthcare, especially in this post-pandemic era? And also, you understand that there are a lot of new ways of exploring different therapies, new treatments, etc. So, how, as an investor, how would you sort of value these new forms of companies?
It's really interesting. I want to take ourselves back to 2003 when we had SARS. And back then, China didn't have the ability to develop their own diagnostic, let alone drugs, vaccines, and whatnot. But, coming back to 2020 last year, we had the Qiming portfolio, we had over 60 companies combating COVID in the front line, spanning from all the areas that I talked about, vaccines to drug development, devices, ventilators, diagnostic, services, internet hospitals, AI imaging, AI drug discovery. So it's really amazing to see how Chinese healthcare companies have advanced over the last 18 years. When I returned from US to China in 2002, in the largest healthcare equipment show, there were 100% of the exhibitors were patient monitoring system and black and white ultrasound machines, nothing innovative. And starting in 2006, when we started seeing the CROs going public, when we started seeing the generic drugs and medical equipment, diagnostic services, every time when such a company goes public, it opens up a new subsector for China. So with COVID, coming back to now, with COVID, we saw that it really, helped advance a lot of in the drug segment, on the vaccine segment. And then we also saw a lot of adoption of new modalities, be it from mRNA to base editing, CRISPR, and so forth, RNAi. So, and, we saw a lot of refocus from oncology to infectious disease and other therapeutic areas, including AI drug discovery. And, on the device and diagnostic, we saw that people are trying to increase the testing, increase the sensitivity and specificity for their testing mechanism. We also see a lot of robotics. We also see people, really digging deep into early cancer screening, and a lot of health tech. How do we combine IT and tech and healthcare? And then, of course, you also mentioned gene and cell therapy. These are areas that we also see a huge investment in as we are looking to combat rare diseases. So it's been a very exciting, last few years of new modalities and new technology coming out from healthcare. And I believe that in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be even more exciting.
So do you think that China is a sort of, in tandem with the rest of the world in terms of all these new developments of, science and technology in this area?
In certain areas, we are still behind. I mean, U.S. and to some part, Europe is still leading in innovation. But when it comes to AI/healthcare, China is actually taking a pretty good lead as we are able to gather information and data a lot faster because of the denser population and so forth. In fact, I believe 2 years ago when the Medtronic global CEO went to China to open up the innovative lab, we had a one-on-one meeting, and he said that there are a couple of companies in our portfolio that have more innovative products, more advanced products than what they have in their portfolio or anything they've seen in the US, which is a great thing. I mean, seeing what we didn't have at all, that we started with only black and white ultrasound machines 20 years ago to now, if you go back to the same exhibition, everything that you can think of, everything that's sold in the Western world are currently available in China, which is great for the patients in China.
Well, that's really encouraging news, and it's a very impressive pace of the development. Actually, coming to the side of investors, we understand that a lot of the investors, especially the general investors, feel it's very hard to value properly healthcare, especially biotech companies, given lack of professional knowledges and expertise. Apparently, that's hasn't really stopped their enthusiasm in coming into this space. But do you see the Hong Kong market has gradually sort of developed into this stage where there are more and more investors and more sophisticated players in this field from investor side, and whether or not the valuation methodology in Hong Kong sort of is in line with the U.S. and in the longer run, how can a general investor or even retail investor try to do better in terms of achieving a better risk-adjusted outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when Hong Kong X started 3 years ago, everybody had a lot of doubts, right? And people say, Hong Kong doesn't have the right ecosystem, we don't have the right people and whatnot. But, it's really amazing to see how the market has matured over the last 3 years. And it has, when we first started, people, were questioning whether or not this is an exchange that could stay for the long term for healthcare companies and biotech. And it's very obvious now, 3 years later, that it is really blossoming to become one of the most impressive and most important listing venue for biotech companies. When we first started, I think, 3 years ago, there weren't that many research analysts. The whole ecosystem, as I mentioned, the bankers and whatnot. Over the last 3 years, we've seen Hong Kong Exchange adding a lot of people, very experienced people into the team. We also see bankers having probably the third or fourth generation of bankers. A lot of the bankers went to become CFOs of companies over the last 3 years also, and research analysts. But we have also seen where the retail investors are really, learning more about the sector. I believe when 3 years ago, I told folks that they should really think about reading prospectus. It's a very good way for them to learn about the sector because every single subsector within healthcare are so different from each other. What's really interesting is in Hong Kong, we do have, because we require at least a phase 2 clinical for the company to go public in Hong Kong. It allows, and then most of the time, the bankers would actually only look for companies with a strong pipeline to go public in Hong Kong. Versus in the U.S., I was told that over 60% of the healthcare investments, IPOs last year in U.S. were in the preclinical stage. That is very, very difficult to evaluate whether or not the company is any good. And on top of that, what's really interesting is the average size raise for Hong Kong healthcare companies about 380 mil versus last year was 222 million in the US. So I think given the later stage of the Hong Kong companies, that also gives a little bit more comfort to the investors. And over the last 3 years, we've also seen more large mutual funds, global funds coming into Hong Kong, which is a very good sign to see, increasingly stepping up and investing as cornerstone anchor or long-term investors into these biotech and healthcare companies, as many of them really truly believe in the China healthcare story. So with that, I believe that there's going to be a huge growth potential for companies. But of course, because of the sophistication of the global mutual funds and the healthcare only, long-only funds, they are also able to cherry pick the better companies. And I believe that the better companies would continue to outperform the lesser companies in Hong Kong, just like everywhere else.
Apparently, international collaborations are super critical in terms of how you can leverage the existing technologies or existing know-hows in the market, and also to sort of tap into a new market, etc. So, have you observed any trends in terms of international collaborations in healthcare and biotech? Especially, what do you think? Hong Kong Exchange gradually becoming like a listing venue for international biotech companies?
Well, most of our companies, if they have any global presence, they would have some sort of collaboration with overseas companies, either academic institutions or companies and whatnot. But when it comes to IPO and listing venue, given the uncertainties of U.S. regulations, we have actually seen an increasing number of companies planning for IPO in Hong Kong instead. It's closer, and the largest public investors are also very well positioned and actively taking part in cornerstone or anchor and public investments here. And on top of that, the Shenzhen Connect and Shanghai Connect also allow Chinese investors to participate in companies whose primary market is China, versus if they were to list in U.S., a lot of the U.S. retail investors or even institutional investors do not know which is which, and many of them don't even know how to model the Chinese market, even after all these years. So Hong Kong Exchange is a very natural listing venue for a lot of these Chinese companies, especially the ones who are looking to go global. Sometimes if they're thinking of purely domestic market, they may consider Asia, but Hong Kong for sure is a very global venue for them. And from time to time, we also see some of our portfolio companies needing to raise US dollars so that they can do overseas acquisitions or global trials internationally where they would be using US dollars. So this is where Hong Kong X also has an advantage.
We're very much looking forward to it. Thank you, Nisa. Thank you so much for joining us for the episode of HKEX Voice. It has been a great pleasure to hear your insights into the biotech listing and investment.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks for inviting me.